Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our History of Bad Ideas, I'm talking to the historian of ideas, Ben Jackson, about a word, an idea, a concept that has had a very checkered history. It's meritocracy. It started out as satire. It became a very successful political slogan. In some ways, it still is a successful political slogan. But today, we increasingly don't know what to think about it. We're going to try and make sense of where the idea of meritocracy came from, but also what it means in 2025. Ben, we're talking about an idea today which is in some ways quite unusual for a series about the history of bad ideas because it was conceived as a bad idea. And one of the unusual things about meritocracy is started life as a bad idea, and somehow it morphed into what for many, but not everyone, for many people became a good idea. And we're here to, in a way, revive the origins of this word and to think about the ways in which it might still be a bad idea. So we should probably start at the beginning with its origin. I don't think Michael Young, who wrote the book, The Rise of the Meritocracy in 1950, I don't think he was the first person to use it, but he pretty much was the person who introduced it into general use. Give us a sense of the context of this book. 1958, Michael Young, social reformer, also academic, the man who wrote the 1945 Labour Party manifesto. What was he doing in 1958 writing a book against the idea of meritocracy?
So as you say, Mike Young is a fascinating figure who had an incredible career, did all sorts of interesting things. And as you mentioned, one of them is that he wrote the 1945 Labour Party manifesto. And then in the 1950s, he makes a transition to being a sociologist. He does a PhD at the LSE. He starts undertaking some of the earliest pioneering studies of working class life through an institute called the Institute of Community Studies that he founds. He then later in life goes on to be a sort of social entrepreneur who founds all sorts of interesting organisations like the Consumers Association and helps found the Open University. But at this particular moment, he's grappling with the legacy of the social reforms that came out of the Second World War and the 1945 Labour government, and the kind of debate about what the left and the Labour Party ought to stand for in the light of those reforms. So I guess one context that he's thinking about and that he's aware of is that there's been a general trend in Britain since the 19th century, and he documents this in the book, towards systems of appointments and remuneration that are based around personal ability rather than connections and nepotism and inheritance. And so he sees this trend emerging in the 19th century, but particularly in the education system and through provision of a national system of state education, which has reached its zenith in Young's mind in the 1944 Education Act, which introduces a system of universal secondary education, but which has a division at age 11 when children who do well in an intelligence test called the 11 Plus are placed in grammar schools, and then other children who don't pass that test are placed in secondary modern schools. And the idea behind this system is that it's supposed to be bringing forward talent and ability from whatever social background you come from, and children who go to grammar schools are the ones that are earmarked to go on to university and higher status occupations and so on. And so Young is thinking about that and extrapolating from that and thinking, well, what does that mean for the kind of society that we're building? And then one other context to throw in is that he's also thinking about debates on the left and the Labour Party about what this means. And there's a debate ongoing in the 1950s in the Labour Party about what does socialism stand for? What does it mean now? And one group of thinkers who contribute to that debate, who are on the right of the Labour Party, known as the revisionists, come up with the idea that socialism should be thought about the distributive goal of equality rather than a particular doctrine about public ownership of the means of production. And Young was close friends with some of those figures, and particularly Anthony Crosland, who wrote the 1956 book, The Future of Socialism. And Crosland argued strongly in that book for equality as the central driving value of the left and Labour. But for Young, there seemed to be an ambiguity in this debate about what does equality mean exactly? Is it a sort of souped up form of equality of opportunity that the left should be aiming for, or is it a more substantive vision of equality? And so in this book, he presents a vision of if we went for the souped up version of equality of opportunity, what would happen? Would it actually fulfill the aspirations that the left have for a good society?
To read the book now, anyone who reads it now is going to be struck by one particular prophecy, which makes it seem very prescient. He talks about the rise of the meritocracy. So, as you say, an extrapolation from the world he recognized to a sort of hyper version of that world where almost everything is based on IQ testing. There's a real sorting out of the classes on the basis of ability plus effort and a creation of a super hierarchical society. And in this book, he describes the eventual revolt against that society. And the name he gives to it is populism, capital P populism, or the populists. And he dates it in the early 2030s. So anyone reading it in 2025 will sense that something about this book is prophetic. And yet, so much of it seems incredibly dated and of its time. And I want to just go through a few of the ways in which, though meritocracy, and we'll talk about the way the term evolved, is a word we recognize now, and many of the things that Young describes we would recognize now, the form in which he thinks meritocracy will evolve seems wrong, frankly. So one is, this isn't just about the 11 plus and who goes to university and who ends up in the civil service. He's imagining a society with more and more finely calibrated IQ testing. And the IQ test itself is the central device, the sort of sorting hat of the meritocratic society. People go in and come out because of their IQ in different roles. And it's as though he imagines a future in which IQ testing becomes more and more sophisticated, more and more prevalent, and people are IQ tested throughout their lives, he suggests, so that you keep checking whether the score is right. That bit seems wrong. So whatever the meritocracy is, it's not an IQ test society, is it? The one that we have now?
No. So I think maybe the other way of looking at the book, of course, is that it's amazing that anything that was written in the 1950s still resonates with us today, given how many things have changed, and that he had kind of alighted on something that did have some kind of traction to the very different lives that we live today is maybe in itself a great achievement. But yeah, as you say, the material about the IQ testing reflects its time. So I suppose he's reflecting there how he understood the debate about IQ testing at the time he was writing, which was the widespread belief among some educationalists anyway, that it was possible to access in a class-neutral way a sort of measurement of what people's intellectual capacity was through IQ tests, and that was predictive of how you would then perform in education, but also professionally in later life. I mean, I think he must have been aware, even at the time he was writing, that many of his peers were already beginning to cast doubt on that assumption. And through the 50s and 60s, there is this big critique of this idea of IQ testing as in any sense measuring anything that's class neutral. Instead, you get an idea that your intellectual capacity is shaped by your social condition. So actually, the kind of left view that develops in the 50s and 60s is much more optimistic about the capacity to mold intelligence and intellectual capacity, or in a more egalitarian way, through changing social policy and educational policy, rather than the idea that there's a kind of inherent intellectual capacity. I'm sure, Young must have partaken of that material as it developed and come to think that as well. So I suppose what he misses about merit as we understand it today is that there's a kind of credentialism, I suppose, that develops, that educational qualifications end up having what economists call a signaling function, rather than necessarily directly measuring intellectual capacity in the way that Young thought. It's a sort of badge that gains you access then to higher status occupations and income by signaling to potential employers that you've been vetted in some way and have the kind of capacities that they're looking for. But he doesn't, I suppose he's thinking sociologically maybe rather than as an economist, so he doesn't have that idea and runs with a fairly fundamentalist notion of IQ.
I think he hints at a credentialist version of it, and that's the phrase that's used by critics of meritocracy today, that it's become a system in which access to the institutions which signal merit is itself a form of the thing that the meritocracy was meant to be fighting against. As you said, it emerged as a cause against nepotism and influence and who you know. And yet we now live in a world where access to these institutions, to get into Harvard in the United States, there are lots of routes in, but it's not just raw IQ. It turns out that the people who want to fulfill the various roles often need certain kinds of insider knowledge and connections and all of that. And I think in the book, Young hints that that's a way in which this is going to evolve. The two things are going to run side by side. There's going to be a kind of IQ aristocracy that will emerge from this, in which, first of all, they will start marrying each other and breeding together. So it'll produce the thing that this was originally meant to push against, which was these new class elites based on family and connection. And then also the other thing that really struck me about it, which I completely agree with you, it's sort of chilling how prophetic it is, especially given how wrong it is. That's one of the amazing things about this book. I think his assumption is that meritocracy is basically a conservative idea. It's the idea of the Conservative Party. So he's writing in 1958. This is in the middle of a period of Conservative government. They've inherited what Labour created after the Second World War, but we're in the middle of a period that runs from 51 to 64 of Conservative hegemony. This is the age, you say, of the grammar schools, the Butler Education Act being put into full force. Various aspects of British society are unreformed. So whatever the Labour government did, it didn't actually reform some of the basic structures of power and influence in British society. And I think Michael Young's assumption was that as the meritocracy develops, the party that would embrace it and almost turn it into a new form of aristocracy with which it would be comfortable would be the Conservative Party. And it would require a Labour Party, maybe an egalitarian Labour Party of the kind that he was imagining might emerge, to push back against it. And that also feels wrong in the sense that if I had to identify a meritocratic party through the end of the 20th century into the 21st century, it would be the Labour Party, the party of higher education. And the Conservative Party in 2025 is much more like the populists that Young imagined. So is it possible to make sense of how that switch happens? Is it just that Young is writing at a time where it's very hard to imagine a future Labour Party that would be the kind that emerged in the 1990s? Or is it about the changes in the nature of conservatism?
It's probably going to be a bit of both. I mean, I think part of what is going on there is that it is quite a labourist book in some sense, in that he has this assumption of what kind of institution the Labour Party is, i.e. it's always going to be the party of the underdog and the underprivileged, and that's its historical mission. So he just assumes that the sort of transition that would happen through the meritocracy would be that Labour would remain the party that's representing the underprivileged. And it's interesting that one of the things he writes about a lot in the book that he's very concerned about is the quality of the leadership that the working class will have. One of the things he says several times in the book is that in the old regime, when there wasn't meritocracy, there were extremely able leaders of the working class, of the trade unions and the Labour Party. He talks a lot about Ernest Bevin, who'd emerged from the trade unions in the interwar period and then been in the 1945 Labour cabinet as Foreign Secretary. And he's sort of concerned that the underdogs are not going to have good enough leaders if the meritocracy sweeps the talented, as he sees it, from the working class. So you can sort of see that he's sort of thinking in those terms, that that's the kind of paradigm he has of what the Labour Party is and how the Labour Party works. I guess maybe the other thing is, I mean, I suppose we're quite surprised by what's happened in politics in the last few years. And it has been a bit head spinning seeing the kind of rapid realignment of electoral coalitions over the last few years and the sort of shift in the Conservative Party towards that red wall constituency. So maybe it's not surprising that Michael Young didn't see it was going to happen. But as you say in the book, he imagines that the party of the privileged and the meritocracy will remain the Conservative Party, and he has sort of various whimsical things about how he sees them sort of reintroducing hereditary privileges once he says it becomes clear that IQ is hereditary and can be detected at a very early age and that kind of thing.
I completely agree that somehow, for me to be sitting here saying, in 1958, he didn't see what was coming in 2025, where I would say 5 years ago, I didn't see what was coming in 2025. It's a bit much to expect that of him. And given that, actually, the ways in which it does resonate is remarkable. I read recently one of the last things that he wrote, which was in 2001. Michael Young died in 2002, which was a complaint about the way in which New Labour had adopted the language of meritocracy without understanding its origins and without understanding the ways in which it was originally satirical, essentially. But the focus of his complaint, this is an article in The Guardian, is precisely the point that you just made, which is what has happened in the meritocratic age is that the underprivileged, the exploited, the underclass in all its various guises, the losers in the society that was being created by New Labour, had lost representation because they didn't have it in the Labour Party, because the Labour Party had become a party in which you had to be credentialed by that point, basically to become an MP. The Labour Party had become a party in which already, I think, in 2001 and certainly today, every single one of its representatives in Parliament, with a tiny handful of exceptions, Angela Rayner is held up now as one, is a university graduate. And in 2001, Michael Young is saying he regrets the passing of the age of Ernest Bevin, and Herbert Morrison is the other one that he flags up in that article, who co-wrote the manifesto with him in 1945. He was the leading Labour figure who presided over Michael Young's work, and he describes their life stories and says, this is just impossible now. That's the thing that we've lost. And the force of that critique really does resonate. Even from 2001 to now, the number of people in Parliament who are not part of the credentialed, educational, meritocratic elite gets smaller with every election.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting with Michael Young. He's such an interesting figure and had such a complicated career because, in some ways, some of the aspects of his later career, were taken up with arguing that Labour needed to move away from a purely working class orientation, because one of the other things he does shortly after writing The Rise of the Meritocracy is start getting interested in consumerism and consumer interests, and he has a proposal that maybe the kind of party of the left might be better organised as a consumers party rather than a workers party. And he does eventually join the SDP as well as part of that kind of movement of intellectuals who sort of feel that the Labour Party has become too workerist in some sense in the 1970s. So it's a bit difficult to pin down what's going on. But I suppose Young, in that article, in some ways he aligned himself with a lot of people who'd been kind of broadly supportive of the early moves that New Labour had made towards tacking to the centre and having more of a kind of broad classless appeal, but then came to feel, as the Blair government unfolded, that they'd taken it much too far in terms of abandoning some of the more basic egalitarian objectives that they saw as central to Labour's mission. And that's what he's saying in that article where he's criticising Blair, because Blair had probably quite casually used this term meritocracy in his rhetoric as a kind of invocation of the society that he envisaged without seemingly thinking through the problems that Young had argued came along with that goal.
And a number of people have identified this trend, which isn't just a phenomenon of, say, the last 10 years, the age of populism in politics. It goes back earlier than that. It's probably a 50-year story, and it's to do with the expansion of higher education, but the ways in which parties of the centre-left, so it would include the Democratic Party in the United States, but also it's happened to various European parties, they became the parties of what are sometimes called the university classes, or in more negative formulations, the sort of Mandarin classes, the Brahmin classes. Rather than being the party of either the workers or the consumers, they became the parties of people with higher education qualifications. And it feels that that's part of what he's railing against at the turn of this century, that the Labour Party could have embraced a consumerist perspective rather than a workerist perspective. But actually, it's almost gone all in on being the party of equality of opportunity, expanding higher education. Under Blair, education is the mantra of the party. That should make Michael Young very uneasy, because if that's your mantra, you are sorting people quite early in life. Even if you're trying to spread your education as widely as you can, 50% of people going into universities, that looks like a very broad, ambitious, in some ways egalitarian goal, but that's the giant sorting hat. It's a 50-50 society, and you get, as a result of that, some of the things that we've seen in politics. In the Brexit vote, university towns voted Remain, non-university towns voted Leave. So it does feel like that bit of it, even though he didn't see how the parties were going to go, the possibility that meritocracy hooked to education, even if it's not IQ testing, or maybe especially if it's not IQ testing because it's credentialism, does become the great divide in democratic politics. And not just in the UK, it's true in the United States. It's been true in continental Europe for a while now. That bit of it feels, even if the labels of the parties get jumbled up, really prophetic.
Yes. I mean, this is the story that he tells in the book, is that eventually there is a counter-reaction to the meritocracy because, as you say, what happens is a very large part of the population is left disenfranchised. And the sort of biting point that Young makes in the book is that if you think of the sort of dominant social morality of a meritocracy, of how it assesses the worth of citizens, it's a much colder and less consoling social hierarchy, Young argues, if you say we've ordered society by merit, and so the people who are at the bottom and who are not doing well, you're there because you're not good enough. That's what Young argues the meritocracy tells people. And meanwhile, it tells the people at the top that they're great, and they become sort of smug and convinced that they deserve to be there, and that sets up a very poisonous social dynamic. And I think that does tap into something. I mean, I'm not sure you would necessarily want to say it's worse than a hereditary system, which is sort of what Young seems to be saying, but it does identify the fact that there is this social hierarchy that emerges from a meritocratic ordering, and that there are going to be people who are excluded from that and lose out and then express politically their disenfranchisement from the system. In the book, it seems to be implicitly a kind of revolutionary action, or certainly some kind of non-parliamentary action seems to sweep away. The book finishes with the author confidently predicting that, nothing bad is going to happen in the forthcoming demonstrations, and then there's a note at the end of the book that tells us that the author died in the riots that took place at Peterloo in 2034 when the populist uprising happened. In Young's day, there seems to be some sort of idea it would be a kind of non-parliamentary action. But in our system today, that certainly is one important way of understanding the populism we have at the moment, is that the sort of meritocratic hierarchy became understood as a new form of class hierarchy, and people who felt excluded from that started to register their disappointment. I do think with New Labour, I think it is complicated, because I think there is sometimes with Labour and that Blair government, in retrospect, we can see that there is maybe a distinction between what they said and what they did. And there was a lot, but Blair's rhetoric certainly was very meritocratic in its tone. There were a lot of social and economic policy measures that they introduced that were concerned with more egalitarian distributive questions. And they certainly took very substantial numbers of people out of poverty, for example, through those measures. So I think there's a different story of New Labour you could tell, which is maybe more of a sort of conventional Labour redistributive story that goes along with that meritocratic rhetoric. But of course, many people, I think, didn't process that was happening at the time, precisely because the rhetoric was kind of pitched in that sort of globalist, boosterist kind of meritocratic terms that Blair was very fond of using.
So I want to talk a bit more about how the word changed and how it got adopted as a term that politicians might use in order to preach a boosterist positive message. But just one more thing about the book, because as you said, it is a satire. So this is not meant to be realism. And part of the satire is a vision of a society in which this cold sorting, this hierarchy, is really emphasized by the fact that he also sees automation and other economic changes more or less hollowing out the working class anyway. So then there's a question of what work can the people do who are not going to be civil servants or surgeons or journalists or any of those jobs. The manual laborers of the past, they're going to be phased out by machines, he thinks. So what are they going to do? And his assumption is the only work that will be left for them is domestic service. And so there's going to be this huge explosion of people working in the households of the meritocrats as their servants. And I thought, this is a bit rich. As satire, this is a bit heavy-handed. And then the producer of this podcast and myself have just been watching Our Friends and Neighbours, which is a satire of the rich, the meritocratic rich in the United States, starring John Hamm from Mad Men. And it portrays a world which is more or less divided. This is East Coast wealth, this is hedge fund wealth, between the Princeton, Harvard-educated, super wealthy elite and their servants. It also has a great bit in it where John Hamm breaks into the house of one of these people looking for stuff to steal because he becomes a cat burglar. And he finds locked away in a drawer their most secret possession, which is they've bought the SAT tests so that they can give their daughter the answers before the test is sat. And it's a glimpse of a world in which the future is basically either she does that or she'll be a housemaid. So even as broad brush satire, if you broaden the sweep of what counts as domestic labour in certain bits of modern societies, maybe particularly East Coast and West Coast American society, it does feel a bit like a world in which the sorting is the people who make the money and the people who serve them.
So one of the things Young says in the book is that eventually, because it's so kind of complicated, and you have all these intractable arguments about how much people should be paid, eventually, I mean, he's not quite as precise as this in how he says it. He seems to suggest that some kind of basic income is introduced, or some kind of idea that everyone is paid the same wage, just to cut out all those arguments. And instead, people who are in higher status professions get lots of extra benefits provided by their employers, whether it's paid for holidays or extra meals. But also, one of the things he says is domestic servants, is that if you have a high status employer, then your employer will then pay for you to have domestic servants. And you're right. I mean, in some ways, he's thinking about the sort of systems of privilege he was familiar with would have been the kind of pre-Second World War British ones, where domestic service was a very significant employer for working class people in Britain before the kind of economic changes that came with the Second World War. And I suppose he's imagining it will go back to that. But as you say, I mean, it is not a million miles away with what happens with the transition into a service sector economy, which, is part of the sort of background economic story to got us to where we are now, because that transition hollows out the sort of well-paid, economically secure manufacturing jobs that were a source of working class wages, but also esteem. And instead, you're replaced with this more polarized labour market where you have high-skill service sector professions, but then also a lot of low-wage service sector employment in fields like catering, hospitality, cleaning, all of these things. And so even if you're not directly employed by the household of a rich person, you could say that some of that service sector employment does look a bit like some of the things that Young envisages, and carries along with it a lot of economic insecurity that wouldn't have gone along with sort of classical working class occupations, industrial working class occupations.
How then do you think, from Young writing the book in 1958 to this cry of pain that he publishes in The Guardian in 2001, how did the term shift to one that politicians became happy to use to describe the thing that they were trying to achieve? Politicians, not just of the centre-left, but of the right as well, and not just in Britain. I think it's also true in the United States. How did the word meritocracy, is it possible even to date when it began to make that shift?
It's a complicated story. I think one thing that happens is just that the term is often used in quite a loose and imprecise way. And if you use it in a very loose way to speak about doing away with inherited privilege and opening up society, that does sound intuitively appealing and is quite politically fertile ground. I mean, one of the things Young says in the book, and I think almost everyone who writes about meritocracy says, is that it is important to distinguish between what seems right about the idea, which is that obviously we do think it's a good idea that people are appointed to jobs on the basis of their ability to perform those jobs. We want to have doctors who are suitably qualified to perform surgery and diagnose illnesses. We want lawyers who are good at being lawyers. That redounds to the benefit of everyone in society because it means you have a more efficient society. But the controversial point is whether the distribution of material rewards and status should also track that occupational hierarchy, so that the people who do the most quote unquote, meritorious work get paid much more than other people and enjoy much more social status. But in political terms, I think that distinction is often fudged a bit, or there's an ambiguity there. And so lots of, especially if you go into the 60s and 70s, a lot of the political rhetoric that's used, for example, by Harold Wilson, the sort of dominant Labour politician of that period, is a pitch to modernise Britain and sweep away the kind of inherited social hierarchies that are holding back Britain's competitiveness, and sort of engage Britain with modern science and technology. And there is a meritocratic edge to some of that language. I do think, though, that a lot of the people around the Labour Party at the time were very conscious of the kind of points that Young were making in his book. And I wouldn't necessarily class the politics of the 60s and 70s as a pure meritocracy, because I think there was a sort of strong egalitarian working class element to the Labour left politics in that period. Trade unions are still very influential. And so there was still a sense that the sort of gap between the rich and poor had to be narrowed as much as possible. So I think there were sort of meritocratic elements to the political rhetoric and the politics of that time, but it wasn't necessarily seen as the only objective of politics. So I suppose I do think, this is a slightly unreconstructed view, but I do tend to think, if we're trying to understand how a sort of pure idea of meritocracy takes hold and becomes seen as desirable, that it really is Thatcherism and the Thatcher period that unleashes this as a social, as a widespread social morality that's widely approved of. I mean, it's sort of complicated to make that case because in some ways, some of the political ideas that Thatcherism was drawing on was also skeptical of meritocracy. But I think there's no doubt that Thatcher presented herself as breaking down barriers, celebrating success. The successful deserve to do well. And it was that kind of model of meritocracy that really took hold in the Thatcher period and was then taken up and attenuated a bit under New Labour. But I mean, I say this is a somewhat unreconstructed view because there are some historians of this period who would actually flip it around the other way and say we should look at the pre-Thatcher period as the classical meritocratic moment. There was a historian called Harold Perkin who wrote this book, The Rise of Professional Society, which was a interpretation of, I mean, all of modern British history really as the kind of rise of ideas about professionalism and expertise. But he did identify this post-war period, he said, as a kind of classical period of meritocratic ideology and advancement, whereas the Thatcher period, it became more complicated and more divisive. But as I said, I think there's more going on in that kind of 45 to 79 period than just a pure adherence to meritocracy.
Do you think it has something to do with the thing that we talked about earlier, which is in Young's vision, this is a meritocracy is anchored to a quite finely calibrated test of merit, which is the IQ test, which can be applied across the board and can be consistently applied to keep people in their rightful place. So that goes. This is not an IQ meritocratic society. So that immediately means it's a more broad brush idea. It's not associated with any particular test of merit. You can, in a way, find the merit that you think suits it. So doctors aren't just doctors because of their IQ skills. There could be a whole range of skills that go into that. So that allows it to become a more comfortable idea. But in that way, it also allows it to become an idea in which the line of argument could be reversed as it might be in the Thatcher period, which is not simply that under meritocracy, people with merit get well rewarded, but being well rewarded is a sign of merit. We haven't really defined what merit is. So the people who are doing well in the 80s, these are meritorious people because we've opened up, we've created a society where we've stripped away inherited privilege. So we have a new test of merit, and the test is success. And that's quite appealing, not to everyone, but to a lot of people. And then you get a version of meritocracy, which is something that could be used by boosters because no one's really pinning down what the merit is. But it's also any, almost exact version of what Young warned against, which is you're going to get in a meritocratic society a tight association between material reward and merit, which will create huge new pockets of privilege. So in a way, the broad brush bit allows it to become what you described, which is the boosterist version.
That's right. I mean, it is complicated for people who are in favour of free markets how to think about these issues because some of their key intellectual gurus, so Friedrich Hayek, for example, explicitly say in their books that they don't believe in meritocracy, partly because they're worried that meritocracy can be a Trojan horse for a lot of economic redistribution, that if you say you believe in equality of opportunity, then they're a bit worried that that suddenly means you're going to need to whack on a giant inheritance tax and stop people holding on to their wealth. But it's also because Hayek argued that if you try and impose a notion of what is meritorious on market outcomes, you drag the state into making these arbitrary value judgments about what is valuable and what is not in society, and that's in a way the road to serfdom, he thought, because you start to get authoritarian state action to shape the market according to this understanding of merit. So if you were a strict Hayekian, you would be a bit worried about this idea of meritocracy as Young talked about it. But as you just pointed out, there is this sort of looser sense of merit, which is actually very close to what Hayek talks about as value, what he calls value rather than merit, which is just that the market rewards people who contribute significantly to production and to generating prosperity, and that has to be respected. The outcome of the market has to be respected. And so I suppose that is something like that is doing the work in the Thatcher period, that these people who got very rich, they created companies, they employed lots of people. This was the argument. Therefore, they deserve the material rewards that go along with that. And they also deserve the social status that goes along with it because entrepreneurship and company leadership hasn't been valued enough in Britain. That was the Thatcher argument. So it's a different way of thinking about merit. And in some ways, it sort of questions, I suppose, how far theorists like Hayek were actually anti-meritocratic, because maybe it's just a sort of different version of, a sort of looser version of what merit might mean, that they're actually interested in is whatever the market delivers is the definition of merit.
And it's also true, I think, that the guru of the centre-left, I suppose you could call him that, John Rawls, the philosopher who wrote A Theory of Justice, which at various points since it was published in the early 1970s right the way through to now is held up as a model of how a redistributive society could work in a way that would meet certain philosophical demands for a kind of universal justification. But he was also a critic of meritocracy. People sometimes point out surprising overlaps between Rawls and Hayek, given they're meant to inspire opposite sides of the political divide. But in a way, one thing they might have in common, and it would connect with what Young was worried about, was from different perspectives, a fear of the ways in which any version of merit as the sorting mechanism in a society would create new pockets of influence or privilege or power. That's another thing that you have to think quite hard about in a meritocratic society, whether you want merit to go with power, especially if it's a democracy. And the idea that there's almost no way in which over time, if you use merit as your primary device for allocating rewards, you will not create pockets of privilege. And in a way, Hayek and Rawls might agree about that, even if they come then to very different conclusions about what you should do about it. The fear of meritocracy is the fear of the people who get picked getting privileges way beyond what they were originally intended to have.
Yeah, and I think they also share an intuition which is, I think, in some ways quite a countercultural intuition, at least judged by public opinion surveys, which is that people don't actually have any control or very much control over their talent and ability, in the sense that whether it's genetic or because of social upbringing, we can't really be held responsible for the economic value of those talents. I mean, it's talents in inverted commas, but our sort of marketable abilities are the product of a sort of mix of genetics and social context that it seems very penal to hold people accountable for. Hayek says that Rawls also makes that argument much more strongly and argues for more sharing of economic resources on that basis. But I think that is a claim that, many people find quite hard to accept, because hardwired into a lot of our modern societies is ideas about individual agency and freedom. And I think that is partly why meritocracy is such an appealing idea, is it sort of speaks to the idea that we are masters of our own fate or destiny, or we can be masters of our own fate and destiny. And the critique of meritocracy brings up some quite unpleasant realities about what, what it is to be an individual in very complex, interconnected societies where actually you don't have that much control over your fate. And I think maybe that partly accounts for the popularity of ideas of meritocracy.
Those opinion surveys are interesting, so you can get lots of different answers depending on what questions you ask. So this is a broad generalization, but I think it still more or less holds that when people are asked about what kind of rewards they think are earned or deserved at the top end of the earning spectrum, in societies where if you reach the very top in certain lines of business, you are going to get really outsized rewards. So hedge funds would be one, but being a professional footballer would be another, or tennis player or golfer. The rewards are quite astonishing. I occasionally find myself looking at the career earnings of tennis players who I think of not being that good, in the sense that they're ranked 13 in the world or something, and you see, oh, it's $25 million. But people don't mind that so much. So they don't seem to mind nearly as much high rewards going to sports stars as they do to fat cats, bankers, and so on. And that's interesting in a sense, because you might think that sporting achievement really is, a lot of it is genetic. But I think most people tend to think, in a world in which a lot of people are very talented, the thing that marks you out at the top is something else. It is merit plus effort, as Young would say. And also the thing about sport is people can come from all sorts of different backgrounds and make it. So there's an interesting argument going on in the world of sport about football, soccer, being a much more meritocratic sport than currently things like rugby or cricket, where actually people are being fed into the England cricket team through certain schools, which are now private schools. So working class kids get scholarships to these private schools. Whereas in football, it is still the case that you can have the best education money can buy with these beautiful playing fields and amazing coaches or whatever, but the Premier League has got very, very few privately educated kids playing in it. And in that sense, it looks like a pure meritocracy. And maybe for those reasons, people are pretty comfortable with the astonishing sums that people earn. In a week, people earning much more than the prime minister earns in a year. And not just the very, very top players, but the middle ranking very top players. That doesn't annoy people nearly as much as what the chief executive of British Gas gets paid.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the emblematic incidents during the New Labour years was this interview that Blair did with Jeremy Paxman, where Jeremy Paxman tried to press him on whether he wanted to reduce inequality, whether he wanted to sort of bring top earners down as well as raising up people at the bottom. And Blair was very, very reluctant to say that. This was one of these interviews that got a lot of people a bit concerned about what was the kind of underpinning ideology of New Labour. And one of the things that Blair said in that interview was, it's not my burning desire to make David Beckham earn less money. And the example he fastened on was exactly the one that you talked about, as sort of sports stars.
Or, Ben, we should say Sir David Beckham now, which is relevant to our discussion. I think that does have some bearing on what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And Blair was aware of the point that you're making, that there are some categories of meritocratic performance that people are more relaxed about than others. And I think maybe that's okay from the point of view of a kind of critique of the meritocracy. I think sports stars, how well still a relatively small number of sports stars do, probably is less concerning in terms of the wider implications of the sort of distribution of economic power in society than the amount of money that's earned by senior executives or heads of hedge funds. The sort of level of economic and social power they command is much greater. And so maybe it is right that that should be more of a concern. I mean, I guess the other thought about that is, I did say that Young says that everyone should ends up earning the same amount in the rise of the meritocracy, but I don't think anyone who's making this critique of meritocracy thinks that you're going to end up with everyone earning the same amount of money. It's more about the extent of the gap, I suppose, between higher earners and lower earners. And that gap has increased a lot, say, post 1970s through various different factors, but does the size of that gap have to be as big as it is now, or could it be reduced? Could the extent of inequality be smaller? And so you could still have a position where sports stars or heads of hedge fund are still earning quite a lot of money, but just not the absolutely humongous amounts of money that they're earning at the moment. The thought, I suppose, being that that extra money that's taken from them could then be used for social programs that would be of wider public benefit and kind of help with increasing the possibility of different groups in society having more equal access to life chances and so on.
I think it's true recently that there has been more of a concerted pushback specifically against the term meritocracy, the way in which it's taken this remarkable journey from satire through to political boosterism. So philosophers like Michael Sandel, who wrote a book against meritocracy, writers in Britain like David Goodhart. There are lots of different arguments, I think, that are marshalled in the case against meritocracy, some of them that we've touched on. But to highlight two, I think, to go back to what we were talking about near the beginning, particularly for someone like Michael Sandel, it is credentialism that has become a big part of the problem, the way in which it warps the structures of a human lifetime, the focus on certain kinds of moments of credentialization, which become these prized assets that then get traded not just for money, but for power and for all sorts of things, and producing these pockets of elite privilege. But also, it's an argument simply about having a much richer idea of what's worth rewarding, what is of value. That the problem with meritocracy is it puts all the focus on the people who have passed the test and hasn't got nearly enough to say about all of the different kinds of value that is created by people who are on the other side of that line. And that does feel like it goes back to Young's original point, that we have completely failed to work hard enough on understanding, rewarding, valuing the rich variety of human life that takes place outside of those places where we think merit meets its reward.
Yeah, that is almost exactly what Young has his populists arguing in The Rise of the Meritocracy. He includes excerpts from the manifestos that these populists issue. And the kind of things they're saying are exactly what you just said, that the problem with the meritocracy is it focuses very narrowly on a certain set of attributes and disproportionately rewards them, and doesn't think about all the other things we value, all the other qualities we value in life, and offer space and status for that. And it's been very interesting seeing these ideas resurface in, there's the Michael Sandel book you mentioned. Another one that came out recently was by the journalist David Goodhart, called Head, Hand, Heart, which also made a very similar argument, again, on this idea that there are certain kinds of work and certain qualities even that are just not valued very much when you have a kind of credentialist model of higher education. I mean, I suppose that what's then raised by that is what, why is it that these ideas have come roaring back now in a way that they didn't seem to have traction in the New Labour era, for example? I mean, there were people who were making this case kind of against the sort of dominant New Labour rhetoric, but it didn't really have very much traction, or in a way seemed somewhat eccentric, actually, in the broader context of the politics of that time. But clearly after, I don't know how we're going to date it, maybe after the financial crisis, after the economic turmoil, but perhaps also after the sort of shredding of the credibility of the economic elite, and then maybe also the political elite during the MP's expenses scandal and the Iraq war and all of those kinds of things. Maybe all of that sort of shook a little bit the sort of faith in the sense that the people at the top know what they're doing, and is what's described as a meritocracy actually a meritocracy. And I suppose there is maybe an ambiguity in some of these contemporary critiques about whether, I mean, is the argument that it's sort of fine to have a hierarchy, it's just that the wrong people are in charge and we just need a better set of people making these decisions? Or is it that we shouldn't have the hierarchy, that we should sort of narrow the gap somehow between the top and the bottom of society? And maybe you get both of those things in the critique. Maybe it's not quite clear which side some of these critics are on. I think maybe Michael Sandel is a bit clearer, that he's sort of arguing against the idea that there is hierarchy and wants to narrow the gap. But if you think of the sort of political rhetoric that's deployed, some of it is more along the lines of, they're all useless, the people in charge. We just need some different people in charge who are not useless.
And I would say Nigel Farage is a very good example of a politician who skillfully straddles that line. He's a Thatcherite. I mean, in origin, he's a Thatcherite. And in that sense, he's a Thatcherite meritocrat. He thinks that under Thatcherism, rewards went to people who, broadly speaking, deserved them. But the one time I heard him speak, it was in Cambridge, I think in about 2014, to an audience of academics and local government people, sort of wonkish meritocratic crowd. And it was an event which was also being monitored by one of the polling firms, I think YouGov, who did that thing with the worm tracker. So while he was speaking, they also had a focus group in another room who were pressing when they were happy with what he was saying and pressing the other button when they were unhappy. And my memory of it was that he basically said three things. Three things were wrong with Britain. The first was that we were about to be swamped with immigrants from Eastern Europe and eventually from Turkey. And that didn't really register with the focus group. The second thing he said was climate change was a scam, and wind farms were a kind of scam, particularly perpetrated by aristocratic landowners and blank from the focus group. The line was flat, like, what is he talking about? These things resonate more now, I think, but not then. And then third, he said, of the then party leaders, Ed Miliband, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, I can't tell them apart. They're all just boys pretending to be grown-ups. Not one of them has ever done a day's work, real work in his life. And the line just shot through the roof. That was the thing that resonated, which was, this thing is a scam. Never mind, climate change is a scam. The meritocracy is a scam. Here are credentialed people, all of them products of the same two universities, those three, doing the same kind of degrees, being taught the same kind of stuff, waving around their credentials, which then got them into this world in which it's who you know that counts. So here's one who's the brother of the other one who could have been leader, and here's Cameron with his connections and Clegg with his connections. They've never done a real day's work, and they're frauds. And it was that case against the meritocracy, which is not that the idea is a bad idea, but that the execution of the idea has become wholly fraudulent. And that feels like it's a really strong strand from 2014 to now in the populist critique, which is, as you say, a bit different from the Michael Sandel idea that there's something wrong with the idea. This is like the idea has been sort of fallen among fraudsters and knaves who have turned it into their own little gravy train. And that's the one that feels like it's still got real teeth to it. That is our populism in lots of ways.
There is a difference between the kind of populism that Michael Young envisages at the end of The Rise of the Meritocracy. I mean, he basically depicts it as a continuation of the sort of British ethical socialist tradition that he was familiar with through his time in the Labour Party. So it's sort of William Morris, R.H. Tawney, these kind of figures were the ones that were he said were being invoked by the populists of 2033 and were making this case about a sort of more plural understanding of human merit. Whereas the populism today, the sort of Farage-type populism, is obviously much harder edged. It comes from the right of politics. And there's, certainly in some versions of it, a kind of anti-political or sort of anti-political elite rhetoric that is not exactly what Michael Young was envisaging his populism was going to look like. And so it's the sort of populism we have today has in a way emerged from the sort of neoliberal Thatcherite worldview that started to take shape in the 80s and 90s, which also in itself had a kind of downplaying of the state and politics implicit within it, the idea that it's really the market that sorts things out in terms of merit and that the state and politics just gets in the way of that. And that it's a sort of adaptation and development of that, which has then taken on a much harder edge because of the various things that have happened, as I mentioned a minute ago, the sort of financial crisis and MPs' expenses are at war. All of those things have kind of helped. And I suppose, maybe actually in a way, the big thing that we haven't talked about is just the fact that the system of social mobility and distribution of life chances has become much, much tougher in recent decades compared to if we go back to that kind of Michael Young period. This was a period of huge expansion of middle class jobs. There was much more room at the top of British society, and so meritocracy seemed like a much more open, fluid idea because it was possible to see the idea that there might be a kind of almost a collective mobility with people rising up from the working class into these good new jobs that were being created, whereas that kind of freezes across the late 20th and early 21st century. And so now there's much more anxiety and competitiveness about one's positional status, and in particular among people in the sort of middle and upper classes about the dangers of downward mobility and trying to insulate their children from downward mobility. All of which, I mean, if, Michael Sandel, I think, is right to say that, in some ways the solution to that is just not to have such a big gap between the rich and the poor, and then the consequences of downward mobility are not as great or not to be as feared as much as they are at the moment. Although that, I mean, it's easy to say that that's the solution. It's much harder. It's much harder politically to bring about a fundamental narrowing of material inequality.
And part of that anxiety is driven by the thought that the entry points into these professions are getting narrower and narrower. There's this fight for access, in a sense, to the top end of reward in the social system that we have. The incredible fight to get into these universities. I think particularly true in the United States. David Brooks, the New York Times journalist, recently wrote an article in which he said the younger generation, the name he's giving them is the rejected generation, because they have to make 50 university applications and 500 internship applications to have a chance of one of them hitting. And in that kind of society, power, control over access to the interview, the introduction, the connection, it feels like it's a reversion to a sort of 18th or 19th century hierarchy where it's who you know. The last thing I want to say about Michael Young's book, which we haven't mentioned, is that he envisages that the populist revolt will be led by women. So he's very clear about that. It's one of the many striking features of his book, that he thinks the populist revolt will in part be a revolt where people say, we want to be led by and represented by people like us. So that in this service economy, his assumption is that a lot of women have been squeezed out of these top jobs because, as he says, they have to take time out when they become pregnant with small children. He's envisaging a world which is, it's not that he's wrong about that. And so in a meritocratic society, it favors men. Men can kind of power through meritocratically, and women have a inherent disadvantage. And then in a service society, a service economy, women are going to fall into these roles. He assumes that women care more than men about social connection. But his basic assumption is that in the populist revolt, what will give it teeth is that the leaders of the revolt will come from the class that is being disadvantaged. And he thinks that primarily will mean women. And it is, again, it's both prophetic and wrong, in that the leaders of the populist revolt, on the whole, do not come from the class that they are representing, and they are not, on the whole, women.
Young's views and writing about gender is something that comes in for a lot of criticism now, not just in The Rise of the Meritocracy, but in his other work, his sort of ethnographic studies of working class life, it now quite heavily criticised for idealising a particular vision of gender relations, a sort of pre-second wave feminism vision of what gender relations look like. And so he did this study with Peter Wilmot called Family and Kinship in East London, where he investigated what life was like as part of working class social networks within East London. And one of the themes that came out was this idealisation of the role of mothers and grandmothers in shaping family life. And I think some of that spills over as well into The Rise of the Meritocracy, that you can see he's sort of trying to think about what women's role in society might look like in a modern society where there's a bit less gender equality than there had been before. But there's still quite a lot of discussion of women's role in terms that doesn't quite capture, I think, the sort of complexity of what then happens, and the sort of idea of dual earner households and all of that doesn't. I mean, it's a bit ambiguous, I think, at points in the text, but that it doesn't seem to be part of the story that he's telling. And as you say, he has this vision that in fact the populist revolt will be led by women. But the sort of populism we see today, I mean, there are some figures who are, I suppose, kind of emerge from the unrepresented parts of society. But by and large, the people who seem to be leading these movements do seem to often come from quite privileged social backgrounds themselves. I mean, it's hard to generalize, but there are, certainly the ones we're familiar with, the famous ones we're familiar with at the moment, do seem to kind of emerge from that kind of world. And what has been confounding to people on the left is that they nonetheless seem to be very effective politically at establishing a rapport with the disadvantaged. I mean, this goes back to, people scratching their head about how to compete with Boris Johnson as a political operator, and people in Labour often reaching for the idea, well, he's just like he's just a private school boy who went to Eton. How can he represent? But clearly it is possible to communicate and have a rapport with an electorate that feels disenfranchised, even if you yourself are not from that background. And there's lessons in political communication, I think, we could take from figures like Johnson and Farage that the sort of left of politics and the Labour Party in Britain don't really seem to have internalised yet.
And you could say that Young offers these two versions of how it could go, one of which is that in a meritocratic society, because the entry points will be more and more carefully policed by the people who've crossed over and passed into the meritocratic elite, it will be harder and harder for there to be political representation of people and by people who come from the class that is disadvantaged. So you can imagine in a work of fiction a populist movement that was led by women who were in low-paid jobs in the service sector and who represent a wide range of disadvantage in the kind of society that we have now, except you then think of reality and you just think, how are those people going to get into politics? That's why Angela Rayner, someone like her, really stands out. But Young's assumption is also, I think, based on a sort of view of spontaneous revolution or something like that, that eventually the pressure will be so great that those leaders will simply emerge. But as of now, there's no sign of that happening.
Yes. In the book, he says he's writing as a sociologist and using the methodology of sociology. But as it happens, he was indeed, by that point that he was writing this book, a sociologist. And so it is a sociologist's book in the sense that he seems to think that social trends shape political outcomes. There is a point in the book where he says, when the time is right, the leaders emerge. The sort of circumstances draw forth the leaders you need.
And these things would start with strikes, he assumed. There would be a strike. The strike would produce a leader from among the workers, and that leader would then more or less lead a march on Westminster. That's the vision of populist change. It's like a 19th century vision. That bit, I can see the appeal of it in a work of fiction. It doesn't really resonate now.
I think that's right. The sort of question of political leadership and how it emerges is more complicated and requires more organisation and agency than Young thinks about. And I suppose what we see now is that if you have a system that sort of legitimates itself as a meritocracy, it has this paradoxical quality where it in some ways becomes less meritocratic because it kind of ossifies into a sort of privileged group that protects its privileges and an underprivileged group, but the kind of policing of that boundary makes it much harder for leadership to emerge of the underprivileged group for the reasons that you set out.
Coming next on the history of bad ideas, I'm going to be talking to the historian Mark Palin about the idea of monopoly. Monopoly as a practice, monopoly as something that still goes on a lot in the world, including in Silicon Valley, about the politics of monopoly and anti-monopoly, and we're also going to be talking about the board game. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.